Hi there, this is Brandon with AutoSlide. Today we're going to be talking about how to set up both your wireless and your hardwired infrared heat motion sensor. So this is the wireless version right here. It'll come with a 9-volt lithium battery, and there are the options to use either sticky pads or screws to attach this sensor to your wall. And then the hardwired version of this sensor looks pretty much the exact same on the outside, except it does not have the internal battery components, but instead has a sensor port for you to feed a cable from this sensor to your system. Now, one feature of these infrared sensors is you'll want to position them in a location of the door that is not exposed to direct sunlight. Since these sensors are heat-based, if sunlight shines directly into this sensor or even reflects strongly into this sensor, such as off of a pool or a shiny metal surface, then it could accidentally set this sensor off. So if you're using these sensors on an exterior door, be sure to mount them at a location where they're not going to be exposed to direct sunlight. The hardwired sensor also includes 2 different lengths of cable. One is going to be, I believe, an 8-foot long sensor extension cable, and then you have a 4-foot long sensor cable. So you have the option to either use just your 4-foot cable, or you could chain these 2 cables together, and that should give you about 12 feet of cable in total. So in this section of the video, I'm going to show you how to pair your wireless or hardwired infrared sensor to your AutoSlide system. So for this demonstration, I'll be using just our wireless infrared sensor. If you had a hardwired infrared sensor, then all you'd have to do to connect it would be to plug the included sensor cable into the port on the back of the sensor, and then plug the other end of your sensor cable into one of your sensor inputs. But for demonstration, we'll be doing this using the wireless infrared sensor. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to configure whether I want this switch or this sensor to be set for a human or a pet. To do this, there is a very small internal switch underneath the gray cables. It is a little black switch that could be set either to the left or to the right. If I have it set to the left, it is going to trigger the outside sensor input, which is for humans. And if I have that set to the right, it's going to trigger the pet sensor input for pets. So I'm going to take a look at that little switch right there. And since I'm going to try a human setup first, I'm going to make sure that this is set to the left for a human input. So once that's done, I'm going to make sure that my power switch on the side of the sensor is turned off, which is down. And then I'm going to tilt my sensor component forward, which will let me take out the battery component right here. And then I'm going to just connect my battery terminal to my battery. So once that's done, I'm going to put my battery back in place like that. And then I'll tilt my sensor back outward, just at approximate angle like so. So I'll go ahead and put the cover of my sensor back on. And this is up to you. If you want, you can go ahead and leave your cover off until after it's mounted. And now before I power on this sensor, there's a couple things I want to make sure of first. So if you're using this for humans, you want to make sure that your AutoSlide system is already programmed and that your human opening width is already set and the system should be on. So if I go ahead and hit my outside sensor input right here on my system's control panel, it'll go ahead and open the door, which is perfect. It means that our AutoSlide system is working properly and that we're good to go with sensor pairing. So I'm going to actually use double-sided sticky tape to mount my sensor for now. And the reason I'm doing this is because sometimes you'll have to play with the positioning and the rotation of the sensor to get an optimal spot where it's out of sunlight, but still able to pick up people or pets. So it's advisable to use double-sided sticky tape first, at least for the first couple of days, to make sure that you have an optimal mounting position and orientation And then once you've found a spot that works best, if you'd like, you can take off the sensor, take out the double-sided tape, and then put in mounting screws into the 3 mounting holes on the back of the sensor. So I'm just gonna get a strip of tape off here, and I'm going to use this to mount my sensor first. So something I'm going to do is I'm going to mount my sensor, and let me take the cover off here so you can see a bit better. If you imagine this sensor shooting out a beam from the lenses right here, that is pretty much your beam of detection. So if I'm going to use this to pick up a person, I'm going to have it mounted more than likely at the top of the door looking down, or at the side of the door like this, looking across at human head height. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and just mount it right here above my door opening. Just like so. So once that's mounted right there, I'm going to go ahead and proceed to calibrating the sensor and then pairing it to the system. So the infrared sensor is self-calibrating, meaning whenever you power it on, it's going to automatically program to the closest thing in front of it. Now, a common mistake that we see people do is when they first power it on, they're right next to the sensor like this. Now, when I first power it on, it's going to start flashing, and then you'll see it flash more rapidly, and then it'll calibrate to the closest object in front of it. Well, if I'm standing right here, that sensor is just going to calibrate to my nose, right? So I'm going to go ahead and back away from this sensor as soon as I power it on. So we're going to flip our power switch on the left side right here, and you might see that blue LED start to flash. So I'm going to back up and let it do its thing here. And you'll see that it's flashing more rapidly, and now it's off. This means that it's calibrated to whatever the closest object in front of it is, or a max distance of about 4.5 feet. So if I walk up to the sensor now, you'll see that it's picking me up, and you can tell because the blue LED is flashing. That's the status indicator. So what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and pair this sensor to our system. So if you'll tell, I'm leaning just far enough out of the way to make sure that this sensor is not picking me up. So on my control panel right here, I'm going to find the button that says Sensor Learn. So I'm going to go ahead and press Sensor Learn one time while staying out of the way of my sensor. So I'll press Sensor Learn, and you'll see a red light come on right next to it. I'm going to wave my hand in front of my infrared sensor, and then I'll wave my hand in front of my infrared sensor again. And you'll see that this red Sensor Learn light is just turned off. So now if I wave my hand in front of this infrared sensor, it goes ahead and opens up the door. Now again, this process only needs to be done for the wireless infrared sensor, right? The hardwired infrared sensor, we connect using a sensor cable directly to one of these hardwired inputs in the system. So if you have a hardwired infrared, you do not need to go through the same process that I just did with Sensor Learn. This is only for a wireless infrared. So now I'll go ahead and set down for my ladder here. And I'll let this door close back up. And now just to test it, I'm going to go ahead and walk up to my door. And once I get within range, this sensor picks me up right away and opens up the door for me. So let me go ahead and just power off my sensor here. Now, one thing that you want to be careful of is you don't want this sensor to be angled straight down or even down and looking towards the panel. The reason for this is this beam, if you imagine it again kind of like a laser beam, it will pick up this panel moving back and forth. And then this sensor is going to be basically set off by the door's own motion, and the door is just going to go back and forth over and over. So you want this at minimum looking straight down, or usually, preferably, slightly outwards at an angle to keep this laser from picking up the movement of the AutoSlide track or the door panel itself. And again, you want to make sure that this is mounted out of direct sunlight exposure. So I'm now going to show you how to configure this sensor and where best to position this sensor for a pet application. So before proceeding, you're going to want to make sure that your AutoSlide system already has your pet mode programmed, and that for the sensor to work, the system is in the pet mode. If it's not in the pet mode, just press your mode button until the orange pet paw light comes on. And then if you want to test your pet opening, you can press the pet sensor button right here, right next to where it says pet sensor. And it should open the door to whatever you have your pet mode programmed with set to. If you haven't yet programmed pet mode, be sure to follow your system's instructions and program your pet mode opening before proceeding. The other thing I'm going to do is, as mentioned earlier in the video, I'm going to make sure that my sensor channel switch for the wireless infrared is set to pet, which is going to be set to the right. So I'm going to look at that little switch right there that's underneath the 4 gray wires, and I'm going to flip that switch to the right. Perfect. So what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and position this sensor where we want, and then we'll pair it to our system. All right, I've zoomed out so you can get a little bit of a better view here, but for pet applications, what you usually want to do is try to mount your infrared sensor lower towards the ground in order for it to pick up a dog. Again, the maximum range on these sensors is about 4.5 to 5 feet. So if you have a door that's about 6 or 7 feet tall where you're mounting this, there's a pretty decent chance that's not going to pick up a smaller sized dog. So what you typically want to do is set it up almost kind of like a laser tripwire. So I'm actually going to mount it at around a doggy neck, doggy torso height. Let's say I have a dog that's about this tall. I'm going to go ahead and mount the sensor just like here. And I'm actually going to have it looking just across the door opening. So I'm going to make sure that my little lenses, my little sensor right here, is not looking inwards, but looking just a little bit outwards. So it's not going straight across the door, but it's just at a slight angle looking outwards from the door like this. Again, we don't want to try to pick up the door's own motion with this sensor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to power this sensor on and calibrate it to the correct distance. Now, this has to be done whether you have a hardwired sensor or a wireless sensor. So I'm going to power this sensor on using the power switch on the side right here, and it's going to start flashing. And then I'm going to just position myself roughly at the edge of the panel because I really don't want this beam to shoot all the way across. So that blue light on the sensor just flickered more rapidly and then it turned off, meaning that it's now calibrated to the closest object in front of it, which is my chest. So if I lean a little bit forward, that sensor's picking me up. If I lean a little bit backward, the sensor no longer picks me up, right? Now, if you want your dog to have to get right up to the door before this sensor activates, then you would go ahead and leave the beam a little bit closer towards the door. But let's say that you want your dog to be able to activate the door from here, then you would take this sensor right here and you would rotate it out just like that. So now, and I'll pretend to be a dog here, if I go ahead and walk up to this sensor and I'm right here, it is picking up the heat from my leg and then it'll activate this door to open. So now that I have my infrared sensor set to pet and mounted and calibrated at a position that I think is going to work, I'm going to go ahead and pair this to my system. Now, just like in the case with a human infrared sensor application, you don't need to do this if you're hardwiring the infrared sensor to your unit. If you're hardwiring the infrared to your system, it should include a sensor cable that will just plug in on one end to the back of the sensor and on the other end to one of your inputs on your system. Now, for the wireless infrared, you do have to go through an RF pairing process. So I'm going to make sure that my system is in pet mode, and I'm going to press the sensor learn button, and a red light will come on right next to it. And then I'm going to just activate my infrared sensor one time, and that sensor learn light just flashed. And then I'll activate my infrared sensor a second time, and that that sensor learn light just turned off. So now if I kind of scoot around the sensor here, and I pretend that I'm walking up to the door as a pet, that infrared sensor will pick me up right around here, and then it'll open just wide enough to let your dog out. So that would be how you configure and install this sensor for a pet application.